In this class, we will study about the interrogative clause with the modal verb. The speaker arranges the modal verb to start the interrogative clause to let the listeners know the information that the clause conveys the interrogative intention of the speaker with the very first word, the modal verb. The speaker starts with the modal verb to convey the intention that the speaker wants to convey the interrogative intention so that the listeners figure out the intention of the speaker with the very first word. As soon as the listeners hear the first word, that is the modal verb, the listeners figure out that the speaker wants to know whether is true or not. The speaker conveys the interrogative clause that the modal verb is applied with the purpose to ask the listeners to clarify whether the intention of the speaker and the opinion of the listeners are accorded or not to the listeners. After the listeners hear the interrogative clause, the responses of the listeners mean that the listeners intend to notify the accordance between the of the listeners. According to the response, yes or no, from the listeners to clarify the agreement or the disagreement, the modal verb to emphasize or assume the definition of the verb that the speaker applies in the interrogative clause practices the original role. The accordance from the response of the listeners, that is yes, means that is able to be described as an emphasis or an assumption that the modal verb means. There is a clause. Do you imagine the better world? The speaker clarifies whether the listeners agree on the interrogative intention that the condition of the present accords with the condition described by the transitive verb imagine. The modal verb do emphasizes the definition of the verb. The speaker intends to figure out that the emphasis of the speaker is accorded with the condition of the listeners. According to the response of the listeners, the description that the condition of the listeners or the subject is the same as the condition described by the transitive verb imagine, whose definition is emphasized by the modal verb do is clarified to be true or not. The listeners agree on answers with the response yes. This means that the condition of the listeners is able to be described by the transitive verb imagine, that is emphasized by the modal verb do. This is the way that the condition is accorded with the condition of the present or not. Let's figure out this part. The listeners who get the interrogative clause from the speaker figure out the present and the description by the verb and the modal verb. The listeners judge comparison between the present and the description by the verb and the modal verb. The listeners who judge that the present and the description by the verb and the modal verb are accorded, the listeners respond with yes. The response of the listeners yes means that the modal verb to emphasize the definition of the verb functions properly. The listeners who compare the present and the description by the verb and the modal verb judge the present and the description by the verb and the modal verb not accorded. The listeners respond with the answer no. The response of the listeners no means that the modal verb to emphasize the definition of the verb, we figure out what the answer yes means. The response yes means the accordance. The intention of the listeners to come up with the affirmative response yes originates from the accordance. The accordance is the result of the comparison between the present and the description by the verb and the modal verb. Let's study the interrogative clause with the modal verb to assume the definition of the verb. There is a clause. Would you imagine the better world? The speaker conveys the intention to clarify whether the condition that the listener says the subject occurred with the condition indicated by the transitive verb imagine, whose definition is described by the modal verb would or not. The response of the listeners figure out the accordance of the assumption of the listeners and the description by the verb and the modal verb would. According to the response of the listeners, the description that the condition that the listeners expected in the past is the same as the condition indicated by the transitive verb imagine, whose definition is described by the modal verb would, is clarified to be true or not. The response yes clarifies the assumption of the listeners is properly described by the modal verb would and the transitive verb imagine.